a trough according to this analysis over here. If I joined those two consecutive troughs, there are two consecutive troughs. However, that is not a valid trend line, because the valid trend line drawn connecting troughs must point upwards. So where is a valid trend line of the 40-week cycle? We can connect this trough over here, and this trough is also a trough of the 40-week cycle. There it is. If I connect those two troughs, then I have an upward pointing valid trend line. Okay, so rule number one is that you must connect the peaks of two consecutive cycles or the troughs of two consecutive cycles. If you connect the peaks, the trend line must move downwards as you move from left to right across the chart. In other words, as you move forward in time. That must be a downward pointing valid trend line. An upward pointing valid trend line must move upwards as you move from left to right, and it must connect the troughs of two consecutive cycles. You can draw valid trend lines, upward and downward valid trend lines, for each and every single cycle. All right. Now, I mentioned there were three rules, and so far we've spoken only about rule number one. What is rule number two? Rule number two is that the trend line, and Hurst was very careful in the way he expressed this. Rule number two is that a trend line, in order to be valid, must be drawn in such a way that price does not cross the trend line. Okay? I found when developing Sentient Trader that, in fact, that statement needs to be qualified a little bit, and I'll demonstrate to you what I mean. Let me turn off the whiteboard and let's zoom in, so we've got a few more trend lines to play with. Here we go. Okay, and turn on the whiteboard. And so, here we go. Here's a perfect example. Let's draw the 40-week upward pointing trend line, upward VTL, for this 40-week cycle. I've drawn that 40-week cycle. I've just emphasized that line. Here is the first trough in price. There is the next trough in price. And so according to rule number one, we can draw a line from here through that point. Okay, it wasn't a very straight line. Sorry about that. But it should be a straight line that joins those two troughs. That's rule number one. Rule number two states that the trend line must be drawn in such a way that price does not cross the trend line. Now, I've done a very poor drawing, but as you can see here, price, I'm going to now emphasize by drawing another big sort of red line over it, comes down here and sort of touches that trend line. Let's assume that price drops just a little bit below it. Let's assume it does. Okay, and then price carries on until this point here. Now, price drops below the trend line there. Does that make it an invalid VTL, an invalid trend line? No, it doesn't. And there is actually some debate. There are some Hurst experts that claim that does invalidate the trend line. However, I believe that is incorrect. The reason is because of the way that Hurst actually worded the second rule and the examples that he gave, in which he demonstrated that the valid trend line must be drawn in such a way that price does not cross that valid trend line. I feel there needs to be a qualifying phrase there, which is that price should not cross the trend line between the troughs that we use to draw the trend line. Price will always cross the trend line after or outside, beyond the troughs that we use to construct the trend line. So let me just speak through that a little more carefully. We have constructed this trend line from this trough over here, okay, to this trough over here. Okay, that's what we've used to construct the trend line. We then extend the trend line further, okay, forever, if necessary. At some point after the construction of, at some point after the second trough or peak that has been used to construct the trend line, price will cross the trend line. And that's a very important moment that we're going to spend some time talking about. That's a very important moment. So price crossing the trend line after that second trough does not invalidate the trend line. Price crossing that trend line in between those two troughs also does not invalidate the trend line, but it forces you to draw the trend line slightly differently. And let me demonstrate to you how you would have to draw it. Let's exaggerate this. Let's assume that price came all the way down to there and then went up. How would you correctly draw this 40-week valid trend line? You would correctly draw this 40-week valid trend line by connecting the price that exceeded the original valid trend line to the second trough. Okay, that is how you do it correctly. I see there's some questions. My voice cuts in and out. Charles says my voice cuts in and out. Are other people experiencing problems with audio? I'm hoping that it doesn't have anything to do with my broadcast, but rather your reception, Charles. It might be necessary to log out and log in again. Please let me know if others are experiencing audio problems. If voice is fine, audio seems fine. Okay, so unfortunately, Charles, I think it might be your connection. It's unfortunately part of the struggle with doing worldwide webinars. We have people from Australia all the way to Canada and everywhere in between. I'm going to keep going. If you have audio problems and it really gets unbearable, then the best approach is usually to log out and try logging in again. But please let me know if the audio disappears entirely, so I don't end up speaking to myself here, which can be a little weird. Okay, so let me just summarize that. The second rule is one that causes some controversy, because where price exceeds the valid trend line, let me find a better example that's that much more obvious. And of course, when you really want a good example, you can't find one. Let's see, where did price? We haven't had any really good examples. Let me zoom right in here. No, that's not a good example. Let me go back one screen. I'm sure over here I'm going to start finding. Yes, in fact, here is a really good example. All right, let me turn off the phasing. Okay. No, it wasn't. I'm sorry about this. Let me just see if I can find a really great example to demonstrate this. This analysis is very pure. There aren't any inverted shapes in it, and so it'll just take me a moment to find a good example. Right, let's try this over here. Yes, that should work. Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to find a really good example of the second rule. Let's draw the valid trend line, upward pointing valid trend line of the 80-day cycle using these two consecutive troughs over here. There's the one trough and there's the other trough as demonstrated in the phasing. And let's draw a straight line connecting these 2 points. And I'm going to do my best to draw a straight line using a mouse, and I extend it. Okay, so now these are the important points. That's the trough, the second trough, and that's the first trough. Now, I hope that you can see that over here, price comes down to the trend line and actually penetrates it slightly and bounces up again. It hasn't penetrated by very much, but Hurst specified that price, the second rule is that the valid trend line must be drawn in such a way that price does not pierce or cross the trend line, the valid trend line, in between the 2 troughs. In between the 2 troughs is the is the little phrase that I added, because of course it always does cross the trend line after those two troughs. Okay, so what happened over here is price crossed there. How do we draw the correct trend line then? Hurst said we must draw the trend line in such a way that that it doesn't get crossed, and so we draw it simply by moving this trend line down and away from price. So we draw it by using that as the first trough and that as the second trough. Okay, so what we do is we actually move the trend line. That's the second rule of valid trend lines. Now, the third rule of valid trend lines applies only to downward pointing trend lines. Only to downward pointing trend lines. Let me turn that whiteboard off and zoom out again, and let's find a downward pointing valid trend line. Here we go. I'm going to be able to do it here, I think. And right. The third rule states that a downward pointing valid trend line must not have a trough of a longer cycle in between the two peaks between which it is drawn. So, if it sounds a little complicated, it's not. Here are two consecutive cycles of the 40-day cycle, there and there. Those are two consecutive troughs of the 40-day cycle. Let's not worry about the fact that there's such different lengths for now. That's a separate subject. Drawing the downward pointing VTL for the 40-day cycle at this point in time would have involved connecting the two consecutive peaks. That's this peak over here, which is the peak, the highest point of the first cycle, and this peak over here, which is the highest point of the second cycle. So there we go. Now we can draw a beautiful valid trend line coming down over there. Notice how price often rises up, touches a trend line, and moves away again. That happens very often. Notice how after a trend line gets crossed, price often comes back down to that trend line and bounces off that trend line. Those are two important little points to emphasize. However, rule number 3 of Hurst's rules states that this is not a valid trend line. It's perfectly okay. According to rule number 1, we have connected the two peaks of two consecutive 40-day cycles. Okay, so rule number 1 is okay. Rule number 2, price doesn't cross the trend line. That's also okay. So this could be a valid trend line. However, there is a third rule which applies only to downward pointing valid trend lines, such as this one here, which is that in between the two peaks between which the trough was, which the trend line was drawn, that's in between this peak here and this peak here, in between there cannot have been a trough of a longer cycle. Now, here you can see there is a trough of the 18-month cycle, which is longer than the 40-day cycle for which we are drawing the VTL, and therefore rule number 3 states that this is not a valid trend line. Okay, those are the 3 rules. That third rule applies only to downward pointing valid trend lines. Now, if all of this is sounding horribly complicated and you think that and you think, how on earth are you going to remember all this? It is only 3 rules, but nevertheless there's quite a lot to bear in mind. You really don't need to worry about it, because Sentient Trader, of course, draws valid trend lines for you. Okay, and all we need to do is click on the VTL button. You can select which cycles you would like to see VTLs for, and we can see VTLs for all of those cycles. And let me zoom all the way out again. Oh, that was a mistake. And here we can see the valid trend lines for all of these cycles. So here is an 18-month valid trend line, color-coded yellow, same as the 18-month cycle is color-coded everywhere else in the software, and there are all the trend lines. So there are a few things to speak about, and so I see some questions. Let me have a look in the chat window and see what that's about. Alain, this could also mean that the first trough is not the trough of the same cycle of the second trough. It is a feedback process. Yes, absolutely, Alain. The first trough is not the trough of the same cycle of the second trough. It's a feedback. Yes, exactly. Let me, for those who might not understand